So I'm going to be speaking on the issue of the language of Lovecraft, in particular in the Call of Cthulhu. I'm just going to be referring to it as Cthulhu for the sake of simplicity, as opposed to trying to actually pronounce the way it is. Can y'all hear me? Super. So my thesis is kind of on this general premise of how is one meant to read and process a story like the Call of Cthulhu when we are faced with the immediate issue of simply saying the title, in particular the word Cthulhu. I'm going to keep saying it in a simple manner, but that's, I mean, we're told this is not the proper pronunciation. So what exactly does the word Cthulhu correspond to, and what does it mean to write it? To kind of address this issue, I'm going to be taking the works of the French theorist Maurice Blanchot, who kind of, his whole idea is, Blanchot argues that writing is founded upon a paradox because the writer is forever trying to write that which is beyond the ability of writing. Writing is focused on the issue of death, and the only way to understand death is to make it a reality for the writer. However, a written work confirms the writer's existence. He has this really wonderful, intense sentence of, language can only begin with the void. So we're going to be talking about the void and death on 9 o'clock on Saturday. Should be a blast. In studying Blanchot's belief on the paradox of writing and then attempting to apply these beliefs to Lovecraft's constructed words, in this case Cthulhu, one is able to see that Lovecraft managed to manipulate the typical human perspective of words and their properties in such a way that his created words become tools to undermine humanity and forward his own beliefs of cosmicism and cosmic horror. And you'll have to excuse me because the only way to really go about this is to kind of dive right into Blanchot's paradoxical theories. So Blanchot kind of poses this general idea of a writer is, when the writer writes, he is working to an outstanding degree. And in writing, he, quote, produces his work by transforming natural and human realities. When he writes, his starting point is a certain state of language. In order to write, he must destroy language in its present form and create it in another form, denying books as he forms a book out of what other books are not. And kind of central to this is the idea, this argument of the real versus the ideal. Blanchot has this analogy of the idea of the desire for heat and then being presented with a stove to warm yourself. The desire for heat is fundamentally different than being warmed by a stove, although we are willing to kind of accept that translation. The book, for Blanchot, is an unforeseeable innovation. This other thing, as he calls it, the book, of which I had only an idea and which I could possibly not have known in advance, is precisely myself becoming an other. There's also then this notion of writing and the freedom that writing kind of entails. When the writer writes, the writer is free to create a world in which anything and everything is possible. The writer, quote, denies everything he is in order to become everything he is not. Writing gives birth to this idea that Blanchot terms universal freedom. However, if there is a universal freedom in writing, that means everything has been done and the rights of an individual are demolished in the face of writing. It's this idea that if everything's free, nothing's free. We've kind of negated the act of negation. Weird stuff. As such, death takes on a huge role in Blanchot's approach to writing. Quote, death is man's most essential right. He needs death so that he can proclaim himself a citizen. In this case, citizen being a member of humanity. Everyone is alive and every single person will die. And so, according to Blanchot, this means that everyone is dead. This is an absolute aspect of being because everyone takes part in it. The act of living and the concept of death are all that humanity have to understand. So this kind of raises the question of, why does death matter to the writer? The desire to speak truthfully about death is what Blanchot deems the question or the essence of literature, because, quote, literature is bound to language. When an individual speaks of a certain thing or aspect, they are attempting to exercise a control over it. In speaking and writing about the apparent truth of death, man is attempting to establish a form of control and understanding over a subject, death, that forever eludes him. Given this, speech and language are something that Blanchot terms life's ease and security. We need speech to express and master ourselves. The analogy I love is, and I don't speak about it constantly, is saying something like this cat. When I say cat, I kind of express a dominance over this ideal that everyone knows what a cat is. But when I say it, I can control it. I manipulate this word and this language. What's important, though, in Blanchot's approach to this is, in naming something, he turns to Hegel, and Hegel has this wonderful kind of scene of Adam naming the animals. And in Hegel's words, what Adam was doing when he named the animals was annihilating them. He was taking these real forms in front of him and again, annihilating or killing them in order to give voice to an ideal abstraction. Again, the cat, Adam pointed at the animal in front of him and said, "That's a cat." And so what we have is this strange sort of death in the birth of the word. It is through death that Blanchot, or the speaker, is able to possess the object he desires. The objects exist in the world, and there is, quote, the only way to have they can have meaning. Death is critical, for without it, quote, everything would sink into absurdity and nothingness. In his analysis, the dual nature of words that Blanchot talks repeatedly about is this. Excuse me. In his analysis of the dual nature of words, Blanchot talks repeatedly about the relationship between the reality and the ideal. The ideal is born through the naming of the reality, and that's how the name carries with it a sense of dominance when used by the speaker. Again, turning to this cat, just to hammer this point home, there's the cat that stands right in front of the writer, a real being, and then there's the word cat as it appears when spoken or written. And this word refers to the ideal form of what was once a reality. In saying this cat, the speaker conveys a sense of power and control over the object he is speaking of. Now, to take this understanding, I want to say, but what happens when we are presented with a word like Cthulhu, or in this story we have these written accounts of people who use this word to kind of give voice to this cosmic horror. The first thing to kind of call attention to in the story is that the nature of it, in that we have a layered narrative. We are presented in reading with the papers of the late Francis Wayland Thurston, and from there we kind of dive deeper and deeper until we hit the account of the sailor Johansson and the encounter with what Johansson calls it. Each section in the story brings us closer to the reality of Cthulhu, as it's called. But as we get closer, the language associated with this reality, this entity, is slowly dropped. Johansson is the only individual who witnesses Cthulhu and lives to record the event, and he's the only character who ever never gives its name. He refers to it only as the thing and it. And so this is kind of interesting sort of situation. And to kind of let's start with when we first encountered the word within this tale. The quote in which we first see the word is, quote, "The writing accompanying this oddity, this bas-relief, was in Professor Angell's most recent hand and made no pretense of literary style. What seemed the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult in characters painstakingly printed to avoid the erroneous reading of a word so unheard of." And so, what most people tend to focus on in the story is the queer bas-relief that we all kind of know is what describes the shape of Cthulhu. But what's interesting in this description of Professor Angell's writing is that we are already hitting on the limits of our own understanding and the extent to which language can express the inexpressible. There is a suggested menace of the bas-relief, but what is equally unsettling is the attention to detail Angell has devoted to his lettering. The words Cthulhu Cult are as large as an affront to humanity as the workings of the diseased fancy of the artist Wilcox. Next, we have this kind of issue of pronunciation. Wilcox, in his account of his dream, says, quote, he heard a voice that was not a voice, and, quote, a chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute to sound. And that's where that's how he develops this word, Cthulhu. What's kind of weird about this is the contradictory nature of his description. What we are reading and even pronouncing is acknowledged as a failure to fully represent what has taken place. Again, it's this idea that a voice that is not a voice, or this, that he hears a sound but it's not a sound. Everything is, there is no, I guess like, our senses fail in a sense already. And then there's also the Inspector Legrasse's account, in which he quotes the cultist as, there are vocal, or this is his account of hearing the word for the first time. Quote, there are vocal qualities to men and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts, and it is terrible to hear the one when the source should yield the other. The words and sounds are so beyond the norm in terms of human words and speech that in order to recite the phrase, y'all are familiar with it, that large jumble of silly letters, I can't say it. Honestly, I thought I'd be able to try and give it a shot at this, but it would just be a disaster. The words and sounds that Inspector Legrasse encountered are so beyond the norms in terms of human words and speech that in order to attempt to recite the phrase, the cultists seemingly reject their own human nature, their humanity, to turn to something more bestial. There is this, they essentially reject themselves in order to try and become an other. The implication here is that while we may be able to somewhat render what, excuse me, I put an incorrect sentence here. The implication here is that while we may be able to somewhat render what is at this point only a sound into words that are made of human characters, there is absolutely nothing human about these words, and to speak them is to undermine all aspects of humanity within the speaker. What is even more important to note is that despite the facts that Wilcox and Legrasse have not encountered this reality that we call Cthulhu, they have a word for it. And albeit one that I'm kind of hinting on, taxes are limits of understanding already and are limits of our ability to communicate with each other. The sailor Johansson, on the other hand, is the only character to encounter this cosmic entity referred to as Cthulhu, and he notes in his account, quote, "The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy." Johansson, the man who witnessed an entity that absolutely goes against all human rules of nature and reality, says that such a thing can never be accurately portrayed within any form of human language. And yet, throughout Thurston's narrative, there is a recurring use of Cthulhu to reference this being. In fact, and I think this is one of the strangest parts of the story, is Thurston even states after we have Johansson's line about the thing cannot be described, that, quote, "Great Cthulhu was loose again," right after, and that kind of runs absolutely against this idea that there is no such language to fully describe it. This is the problem within Lovecraft's work. The reality of the object, the stumbling mountain of flesh that is Cthulhu, does not fit into the human understanding of what is real and natural. Furthering this point is that Johansson is one of 8 men to land on this mysterious island. Again, I'm not going to try and pronounce it correctly. Of those men, 4 die from physical violence. We have Parker, who falls into this angle that's misbehaving, and then 3 men who are seized up in a flapping claw. And then there's 3 others who all die essentially from shock, or the sense that, in my mind, I think it's the greatest violence in the story, is they seem to not be able to comprehend what they're faced with, and in my vivid imagination, their brains explode. They have no way to process this sheer rupturing of what we understand to be reality. Jumping back to Blanchot, it's clear that Blanchot's argument about the relationship between the reality and the ideal in a word seems wholly inadequate when confronted with something like Cthulhu. The reality of Cthulhu is not to be understood by man, and so an attempt to try and contain this concept within a word, even if one is meant to maximize the intimate aspects of this object, can never completely succeed. If this theory about the dual nature of words does not hold up within Lovecraft's writing, then this opens up the rest of Blanchot's arguments for critical introspection and debate. Further, we can use these potential shortcomings to see just how far Lovecraft pushes our limits of understanding in the face of cosmicism and cosmic horror. In pronouncing or writing a word, the author announces the death of the reality he's referring to. Again, I say this cat, and the existing reality of the cat I have in my mind is, in Hegel's words, again, annihilated to create a new life, the cat of which I speak. Although Johansson's testament shows that the entity he encounters is completely beyond any form of human reasoning, there is a word that we kind of paradoxically have to refer to this, Cthulhu. Legrasse and Professor Webb are able to recognize the similarities of their experiences with 2 very different groups of people through the recurring use of the word, and Thurston is able to gain a sense of all accounts through the same word. However, with each of these men utilize the word Cthulhu, are they actually announcing the death of the reality and creating an ideal form represented by a word that they as writers and speakers should be able to control? In short, is saying Cthulhu the equivalent of saying cat? For Blanchot, death is the most critical component of writing and construction of the word. Death is man's most essential right, he argues. With the writing of a word, the writer is decreeing the death of the individual object in order to make way for the ideal that all of humanity should be capable of understanding. Man needs death in order to realize his own humanity, and thus relies on death as a way to place other objects within his means of understanding. The problem we then face in Lovecraft's work is that his characters are trying to bring death, a humanizing component, to that which is beyond humanity. Johansson says that what he witnessed was beyond, quote, all matter of force and cosmic order, and this is reinforced by the much discussed couplet we have from the NecronomiCon. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. What's important to realize from that is, if we are to take that couplet at face value, death is irrelevant to this cosmic being, Cthulhu. The second line, and further, this idea that death may die, kind of suggests that our understanding of reality is limited at best and absolutely wrong works that we're living in, we are too friggin' dumb to get what's going on. If the real object, the thing, in Johansson's words, is beyond death, then the variables that Blanchot applies to such words as this cat crumble. The word Cthulhu is not so much the suggestion of an ideal form, but a living reminder on the page, or in the voices of those who speak it, that there are powers far greater than limited perspective of man. Again, to further kind of, to really drive this point home, we have Johansson's handwriting is remarked on and giving out as he records his account. The idea that writing should be a liberating and free process is ruptured as he loses control of his own experience in trying to recount what he witnessed. The critical issue for all of Lovecraft's characters, beyond this story, is who try to write about these types of experiences, that while Blanchot argues that the ideal is always elusive, for these writers, the ideal is a living thing and its existence seems to signal the depth of the characters. Within Lovecraft's realm is not the writer who is endowed with the ability to give death to his subjects. Rather, these objects are already living and come, although, again, referring to that couple, what can be alive that can't die? And come to close of the story are the only things left. The writers and the speakers of these stories die, and in doing so, maximize the reality of the cosmic entities and the horrors of which they try to speak about. I'll just wrap it up really quickly. We could go on for far too long. Blanchot's argument is that writing is a paradox in that we try to write to make sense of that which we cannot understand, death or non-existence. And so man is forever drawn to writing to try and give truth to this death. Lovecraft does the exact opposite in that his cosmic horrors or his cosmic entities are, for lack of a better word, alive on the page. And in his written confessions, we have this kind of counter message of the only way to be spared these sort of horrors is for us to give up writing. And I mean, there's the wonderful line that I'll just close with from Thurston's own notes, and they put it best, quote, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all of its contents. End quote. In order to preserve this oblivious state and be spared the onslaught of the cosmos, man must cease to